The crowd thought Ethan Cross had finally lost his nerve. The final lap began beneath a storm of stadium lights and roaring engines as more than 70,000 people rose to their feet inside Blackstone Raceway. Damian Wolf's silver supercar screamed down the straightaway at nearly 190 miles per hour, while Ethan's old Nissan GTR stayed glued to his rear bumper like a ghost from another lifetime. Commentators shouted over each other. Fans held their breath. One more corner remained before the finish line, and everyone watching knew the same thing. Ethan Cross was about to attempt the impossible. For the first time in 20 years, the legend known as the Iron Phantom was close enough to take the lead. Damian glanced into his rearview mirror and saw the headlights of the black GTR growing larger with every second. His confidence cracked instantly. Just an hour earlier, people had laughed when Ethan rolled the aging car onto the track. They mocked the faded paint, the outdated body lines, and the man behind the wheel whose limp was visible even from the pit lane. To them, Ethan Cross was just a broken relic trying to relive a dead career. But now nobody was laughing anymore. Because once the road curved into the mountain section, Ethan transformed into something terrifyingly precise. The old GTR moved through corners with impossible smoothness, every turn controlled within inches, every drift measured like mathematics. It no longer looked like a race car being driven by a man. It looked like the road itself was carrying him forward. Damian pushed harder. The speedometer climbed higher. The crowd erupted as sparks flashed briefly beneath his chassis, entering the final downhill sector. Then came Raven's Curve, the most dangerous turn on the circuit, a sharp bend protected by only a narrow safety lane and concrete barriers beyond it. 20 years earlier, another driver had nearly lost his life there during a professional race. Ethan remembered every detail. The smell of burning rubber, the white smoke, the sound of twisting metal. He remembered waking up in a hospital bed with doctors telling him his racing career was over forever. And now, as Damian charged recklessly toward the same corner, Ethan saw the exact same madness in the younger man's eyes. Damian suddenly cut across the restricted inside lane to block Ethan from overtaking him, ignoring the warning lights flashing along the edge of the track. Gasps rippled through the stadium. Even from the stands, people could tell the move was dangerous. One mistake at that speed could send both cars spinning out of control. Ethan's hands tightened around the wheel. His pulse thundered in his ears. For a split second, instinct took over. The same instinct that had ruled his entire life. Faster. Push harder. Win no matter what. His right foot hovered over the accelerator. The engine roared louder beneath him, hungry for one final burst of speed. And then something changed. Ethan looked past Damian's car and saw the faces of the boys from his garage standing near the fence line. Noah Blake was there holding his breath. Walter Hayes stood beside him with grease still on his old work jacket. The kids who once spent their nights street racing and throwing punches behind convenience stores were now watching him like he was more than just a driver. They believed he had taught them something better than victory. Ethan suddenly realized that if he kept chasing Damian into that corner, he would become the same man who destroyed his own life 20 years ago. The same man addicted to winning at any cost. The same man who believed survival mattered less than crossing a finish line first. So instead of accelerating, Ethan slowly eased his foot off the gas pedal. The black Nissan drifted outward into the safety lane, while Damian shot across the finish line alone beneath exploding lights and deafening cheers. For 3 full seconds, nobody understood what had happened. Then the replay appeared on the giant screen above the track. Damian's illegal move. Ethan's decision to avoid the collision. The silence inside the stadium felt heavier than the sound of engines. Damian climbed out of his car expecting celebration, but the crowd was no longer looking at him. One person started clapping near the front row, then another, and another, until the entire stadium rose to its feet, applauding the man who had willingly given up victory. Ethan sat quietly inside the GTR as the sound washed over him like a wave he never expected to hear again. Not because he had returned to racing, but because for the first time in his entire life, Ethan Cross had finally defeated the part of himself that was willing to die just to win. Long before people called him a legend, Ethan Cross was just a skinny kid from a small Ohio town who spent more time inside garages than inside classrooms. His father repaired delivery trucks behind a gas station off Interstate 75, and Ethan grew up surrounded by the smell of oil, burnt rubber, and old country music playing through dusty radio speakers. By the age of 12, he could take apart a carburetor faster than most grown mechanics. By 15, he was sneaking onto abandoned roads outside town to race anything with 4 wheels and an engine. Speed made sense to him in a way normal life never did. On the road, everything became quiet inside his mind. Fear disappeared. Doubt disappeared. Even pain disappeared. All that mattered was the next turn and the sound of the engine answering his touch. At 23 years old, Ethan entered professional racing with almost no money and no famous sponsors. The media laughed at him during his first season because he drove aggressively and rarely spoke during interviews. One reporter called him a machine pretending to be human. Ethan never corrected them. He won his first Grand Prix in Phoenix during a brutal rainstorm that forced half the field to retire early. While other drivers slowed down, Ethan accelerated through the water like he had nothing to lose. By the final lap, people inside the stadium had already started chanting his name. That night, sports channels across America replayed the footage over and over again. The black helmet, the impossible cornering speed, the emotionless stare after the victory. From that moment forward, Ethan Cross became the most feared driver in Formula One. They called him the Iron Phantom because nobody ever saw panic in his eyes. Not during crashes, not during mechanical failures, not even when rival drivers tried forcing him. Off the track, for over 2 decades, Ethan dominated the racing world with terrifying consistency. He broke speed records in Italy, Germany, Japan, and Brazil. Sponsors fought each other for contracts worth millions of dollars. Fans filled stadiums wearing black jackets with Silver Wolf logos stitched onto the back. Children taped posters of Ethan Cross above their beds like he was some kind of modern outlaw hero. But behind the trophies and fame, Ethan was quietly becoming addicted to danger itself. Winning stopped being enough after a while. He needed the feeling of surviving inches away from disaster. Every race became another chance to prove he could outrun fear. His crew members noticed the change long before the public did. Ethan stayed inside the garage later than everyone else, studying tire temperatures and corner data with unhealthy obsession. He barely slept during race weekends. Coffee and adrenaline carried him through entire seasons. Sometimes mechanics would find him alone inside the cockpit after midnight with the engine off and his hands gripping the steering wheel in total silence. Claire Bennett, the only journalist Ethan ever trusted, once asked him why he kept pushing himself harder every year even after becoming world champion multiple times. Ethan looked at the racetrack outside the interview window before answering quietly. Because the second I slow down, somebody else becomes unforgettable. Claire never forgot those words. Neither did Ethan. At 55 years old, after 21 brutal seasons in Formula One, Ethan entered the final race that would change everything. The Grand Prix took place beneath bright white lights in Singapore with millions of viewers watching around the world. Ethan qualified in second place despite ongoing pain in his right leg and months of pressure from critics claiming he was too old to compete at the highest level anymore. Younger drivers mocked him openly. Commentators debated retirement during live broadcasts. Ethan ignored all of it. The race itself felt almost supernatural from the beginning. Ethan drove faster than anyone expected, carving through traffic with terrifying precision. Lap after lap, he climbed closer to first place until only one driver remained ahead of him entering the final stretch. Then the rain started falling. Not enough to stop the race, just enough to make every corner dangerous. The crowd stood as Ethan accelerated into the final sector, chasing one last victory before retirement. What happened next would replay across television screens for decades. Ethan attacked the final corner at nearly 200 miles per hour while fighting for position. For one brief moment, the rear tires lost grip against the wet asphalt. The car spun sideways. Sparks exploded beneath the chassis as the vehicle slammed into the outside barrier and disappeared into a cloud of smoke and shattered debris. The stadium fell silent. Claire Bennett later said the quiet after the impact felt more frightening than the crash itself. Rescue crews reached Ethan within seconds. He survived, but the doctors delivered news that shattered his entire world. His right leg had suffered severe damage along with multiple injuries throughout his body. Recovery would take years. Professional racing was over forever. The man who built his entire identity around speed suddenly woke up trapped inside a body that could barely walk across a hospital room without assistance. The world moved on from Ethan Cross far faster than Ethan Cross moved on from racing. Within months of the accident, television networks stopped replaying his victories and started celebrating younger drivers instead. New champions appeared. New rivalries replaced old legends. The massive sponsorship banners carrying Ethan's face slowly disappeared from airports, billboards, and racing magazines across America. For everyone else, it was the end of an era. For Ethan, it felt like being buried alive while still breathing. The rehabilitation center outside Denver became his entire world for nearly 3 years. Every morning began with pain medication, physical therapy, and long silent walks between metal bars designed to help him relearn balance. Some days he managed only a few steps before collapsing into exhaustion. The doctors remained patient, but Ethan hated the sympathy in their eyes. He hated wheelchairs. He hated hospital walls. Most of all, he hated hearing people describe him as inspirational for surviving. Survival meant nothing to him if he could never race again. During the first year after the accident, Ethan refused nearly every interview request. Fans mailed thousands of letters to the clinic, but he never answered any of them. Claire Bennett visited him twice during recovery and later admitted she barely recognized the man sitting in front of her. The sharp confidence was gone. The famous cold stare had faded into something empty and exhausted. Ethan spent hours staring through the rehabilitation center windows, watching traffic pass on distant highways. Sometimes he would ask nurses to mute the television whenever Formula One highlights appeared. Other nights, he secretly watched old race footage alone after everyone else went to sleep. He replayed the Singapore crash more than any sane person should. Frame by frame, corner by corner, as if studying the moment long enough might somehow change the ending. Alcohol slowly became part of his routine after leaving the clinic. Not enough to destroy himself publicly, just enough to quiet the noise in his mind for a few hours each night. Ethan moved into a dark apartment in downtown Chicago where almost nobody recognized him anymore. The walls remained bare except for one framed photograph hidden inside a closet, showing him holding his third World Championship trophy beside his racing team. He never displayed it openly. Most mornings, Ethan woke before sunrise because his damaged legs still ached whenever temperatures dropped below 40 degrees. He walked with a noticeable limp now, especially during winter. The man who once moved with absolute precision across racetracks around the world now struggled climbing apartment stairs while carrying groceries. Some nights, he drove alone through empty industrial roads outside the city simply to hear an engine again. He still loved driving more than anything on earth. That was the cruelest part. His body had betrayed him, but his heart never stopped craving speed. Nearly 20 years passed that way. Quietly, the world forgot the name Ethan Cross little by little. Younger racing fans only knew him through old documentaries and internet clips showing impossible overtakes from another era. To them, he looked more like mythology than a real person. Ethan preferred it that way. Then one October morning, after another sleepless night spent watching rain slide down his apartment window, Ethan packed everything he owned into the back of an old pickup truck and disappeared without telling anyone. No announcement, no interviews, no farewell. He drove south for 2 days before arriving in a small highway town outside New Mexico where faded motels, truck stops, and rusted gas stations lined Route 66 like forgotten memories from another century. The town itself felt worn down, but stubbornly alive. People still sat outside diners drinking coffee at sunrise. Mechanics still fixed old engines instead of replacing them. Nobody cared about celebrity status there. That was exactly why Ethan stayed. Near the edge of town stood an abandoned garage with cracked windows and a collapsing wooden sign swinging above the entrance. Dust covered everything inside. Old tools lay scattered beneath shelves coated in years of neglect. Most people saw a dead business waiting to be demolished. Ethan saw silence. He rented the building that same afternoon using cash and signed the paperwork under the name E. Cross. The owner never recognized him. For the first few weeks, almost nobody visited the garage except local truck drivers needing cheap repairs. Ethan worked alone from sunrise until dark wearing oil-stained gloves and an old black jacket. He rarely spoke unless necessary. Yet word spread strangely fast through town. People noticed the quiet mechanic with the damaged leg could diagnose engine problems just by listening for a few seconds. He repaired transmissions other shops had given up on. He fixed an old farmer's pickup truck for free after learning the man could not afford the bill. Taxi drivers started recommending him. Construction workers brought their vans to his garage before dawn. Without realizing it, Ethan Cross slowly became part of the town. Not as a legend, not as a champion, just as a mechanic trying to stay busy long enough to outrun his own memories. Winter arrived early that year, covering the highway town in cold desert wind and pale gray skies that made the old garage feel even more isolated from the rest of the world. Ethan Cross settled into a routine so quiet and repetitive that some days blended together completely. He opened the garage before sunrise every morning with a cup of black coffee in one hand and his aching right leg dragging slightly behind him. The old radio near the workbench played classic rock through static while engines came and went throughout the day. Most customers never asked questions about Ethan's past. They only cared that their trucks started properly after he touched them. And Ethan preferred it that way. Silence felt safer than attention. One freezing morning, an old blue tow truck rattled into the garage parking lot trailing smoke from the exhaust pipe. Behind the wheel sat a gray-haired mechanic wearing a faded denim jacket with patches stitched along the sleeves from companies that no longer existed. The man climbed out slowly, stretching his back with the exhausted expression of someone who had spent 50 years lifting engines and crawling beneath vehicles. "Transmission is dying," he muttered before Ethan even reached the truck. Ethan listened to the engine idle for less than 10 seconds before replying quietly. "Not the transmission. Loose vacuum line near the intake manifold." The old mechanic stared at him suspiciously. Then he opened the hood, checked the engine, and froze. Ethan was right. The man burst into laughter so loud it echoed across the garage walls. "Well, I will be damned," he said. "Most shops in this town would have charged me $3,000 for a problem worth $20. That was how Walter Hayes entered Ethan's life. Walter had once owned a respected repair shop in Albuquerque before large corporate dealerships slowly crushed small businesses across the state. By the time he turned 65, nobody wanted to hire an old mechanic anymore. Younger managers treated experienced workers like outdated equipment instead of human beings. Walter picked up temporary jobs where he could, but most days he simply drove around, trying to stay useful. Ethan never officially offered him employment. Walter just kept showing up every morning after that. At first, he helped organize tools and sweep the floor. A few days later, he started repairing brakes without asking permission. Within a month, he acted like the garage belonged to both of them. Ethan pretended to dislike it, but secretly the company helped more than he admitted. For the first time in years, the garage sounded alive instead of lonely. Walter talked constantly while working. Stories about old road trips, broken motorcycles, failed marriages, and impossible repairs filled the empty hours. Ethan rarely answered with more than a few words, but Walter never seemed bothered by the silence. "You know what your problem is?" Walter asked one afternoon while rebuilding a carburetor. Ethan kept tightening bolts without looking up. "I was hoping you would tell me." Walter grinned. "You still walk around like somebody waiting for permission to live again." Ethan stopped moving for a moment, but said nothing. Walter continued working like he had not just dropped a grenade into the middle of the conversation. Over time, more older mechanics drifted toward the garage the same way abandoned dogs find warm porches during winter storms. Frank Molina arrived first, bringing 30 years of diesel engine experience and terrible singing habits. Then came Curtis Lane, a retired NASCAR pit crew technician whose hands still moved with unbelievable speed despite arthritis. None of them had much money. None of them fit into modern automotive shops anymore either. Yet inside Ethan's garage, they suddenly mattered again. The building slowly transformed from a forgotten repair shop into something almost resembling family. Old neon signs lit the walls at night. Music played louder. Coffee stayed brewing constantly. Laughter replaced silence. Local customers started lingering after repairs just to talk with the old mechanics about engines and highway stories from decades earlier. Ethan still spent most evenings alone after closing time, but something inside him had begun shifting without his permission. One night, while cleaning grease from his hands near the garage entrance, Ethan noticed several teenagers gathered across the street beside modified streetcars covered in bright decals and oversized exhaust systems. Loud music shook the parking lot while the boys argued over illegal races happening outside town. One teenager stood apart from the others, leaning against a black Mustang with restless energy burning in his eyes. His name was Noah Blake. Ethan recognized the look immediately because 25 years earlier, he had seen the exact same hunger staring back at him from every mirror. Noah Blake started showing up outside the garage almost every night after that. Sometimes he leaned against his black Mustang, smoking cheap cigarettes, while loud music rattled from the car speakers. Other nights, he sat silently on the hood, watching Ethan work through the open garage door without saying a word. He could not have been older than 19, but exhaustion already lived behind his eyes like someone much older. The other boys who raced with him drifted in and out of town chasing trouble, money, or attention. Noah always returned to the garage. Ethan noticed everything without appearing to notice anything. The shaking hands hidden inside jacket pockets. The bruises beneath Noah's sleeves after street fights. The way he stared at engines with genuine curiosity whenever Walter explained repairs to customers. One cold evening around closing time, Noah wandered inside while Ethan was rebuilding a transmission beneath hanging fluorescent lights. "You really fixed that truck in under an hour?" Noah asked quietly. Ethan kept working. Truck only needed 20 minutes. The owner needed the extra 40, so he would stop talking. Noah laughed unexpectedly. It was the first real expression Ethan had seen from him. The boy walked slowly around the garage, studying the old tools, faded signs, and shelves packed with engine parts. "This place smells like my grandfather's workshop," he said. "He used to fix dirt bikes before he passed away." Ethan wiped grease from his hands with a rag. "Then you already know most people only come to garages when something is broken." Noah nodded slowly, like he understood the sentence meant more than cars. Before leaving that night, he paused near the entrance. "You ever race anymore?" Ethan's face hardened instantly. "No." The answer came so cold and final that Noah immediately regretted asking. But instead of leaving, he looked down at the concrete floor and admitted quietly, "I race out on Route 9 sometimes. Mostly for cash." Walter overheard the conversation from across the garage and muttered under his breath, "That road is going to get somebody killed one day." Noah shrugged like danger no longer mattered to him. Ethan recognized that attitude better than anyone alive. Over the next few weeks, Noah returned more often. Sometimes he helped clean tools in exchange for coffee and burgers from the diner across the street. Other times he simply watched Ethan diagnose engines by sound alone. One night, after hearing Noah and his friends revving engines outside town past midnight, Ethan drove to the abandoned industrial strip where local street races happened illegally every weekend. Dozens of young drivers crowded around modified cars beneath broken parking lot lights, while spectators filmed everything on their phones. Ethan stayed inside his pickup truck, observing quietly from a distance. Then Noah lined up against another Mustang at the starting line. Ethan watched the boy grip the steering wheel with the same reckless hunger he once carried in his own chest decades earlier. The race lasted less than 2 minutes before Noah nearly lost control, entering a sharp corner too fast. Tires screeched violently as the car slid sideways across loose gravel before recovering at the last second. The crowd exploded with cheers afterward, but Ethan sat frozen behind the wheel of his truck, staring at the road in silence. He had seen that exact moment before, thousands of times. Young drivers believing they were immortal because fear had not caught them yet. The next morning, Noah arrived at the garage expecting another normal day. Instead, Ethan tossed an oil-stained rag directly into his chest. "If you are going to stand around here every day," Ethan said without looking up from the engine he was repairing, "learn how to make yourself useful." Noah blinked in confusion. "You serious?" "No," Walter interrupted loudly from nearby. "We just hand dirty towels to strangers for entertainment." Frank Molina burst into laughter while Curtis shook his head, smiling. Noah stood there awkwardly for a second before finally grabbing the rag and helping Walter organize socket wrenches near the workbench. That was how it started. One teenager became 2, then 4. Then nearly every kid involved in the local racing scene began drifting through the garage after dark. Some came because they admired cars. Others came because they had nowhere else to go. Ethan never officially invited any of them. He simply allowed them to stay as long as they worked. Soon the garage stayed open long after sunset, with engines scattered across workbenches while old mechanics taught teenagers skills most schools no longer cared about. Walter explained transmissions. Curtis taught tire balancing and suspension tuning. Frank yelled constantly about respecting tools properly. Ethan taught something else entirely. Discipline, patience, self-control. Anybody can drive fast in a straight line, he told them one night while sketching racing lines across an old piece of cardboard. The dangerous part is believing speed makes you invincible. Noah listened more carefully than anyone else in the room. For the first time in years, the garage no longer felt like a hiding place from Ethan's past. It was becoming something entirely different. A second chance none of them expected to find. Spring brought more customers than the garage had seen in years. Pickup trucks lined the gravel lot before sunrise while motorcycles waited outside the service bays through most afternoons. People trusted Ethan and the old mechanics because they fixed problems honestly instead of inventing expensive repairs. Some customers drove more than 50 miles just to have Ethan listen to an engine for 5 minutes. The garage no longer looked abandoned. Fresh lights glowed through the windows at night. Music echoed from the workbenches. Noah and the other boys painted the outside walls black and silver during weekends, while Walter proudly called the place the last real garage left in America. For the first time in decades, Ethan almost felt at peace. Then Damian Wolf arrived. The sound of expensive engines rolling into the parking lot turned every head inside the garage that afternoon. 3 polished luxury sports cars stopped outside, while men in tailored jackets stepped onto the gravel, looking completely out of place beside oil stains and rusted toolboxes. Damian emerged last, wearing dark sunglasses and a charcoal coat that probably cost more than most vehicles in town. He looked young, confident, and carefully manufactured for magazine covers. Noah immediately whispered, "That is Damian Wolf." Even the older mechanics recognized the name. Damian owned Wolf Performance Group, a rapidly growing luxury automotive company famous for custom supercars, racing sponsorships, and flashy online marketing campaigns watched by millions. Ethan wiped grease from his hands slowly while Damian surveyed the garage with visible disgust. "This place smells like gasoline and regret," Damian said casually. Walter muttered something under his breath that made Frank laugh loudly. Damian ignored them and continued walking through the garage like a businessman inspecting condemned property. "I recently purchased the land surrounding this highway district," he explained. "The city approved my proposal to build a modern performance showroom and driving center here." Noah frowned immediately. "You are tearing this place down?" Damian finally smiled. "Not immediately. I plan to give the current tenants 30 days to leave." Silence settled across the garage. Walter stopped working. Curtis slowly removed his glasses. Ethan remained expressionless, but the tightening in his jaw did not go unnoticed. Damian walked toward the back wall, studying old tools hanging from wooden shelves. "Honestly," he said, "this entire building belongs in a museum. Old men repairing dead machines while teaching teenagers outdated skills." Noah stepped forward angrily, but Ethan raised one hand slightly without taking his eyes off Damian. The room fell quiet again. Damian finally stopped near Ethan's workbench and removed his sunglasses. For several seconds, he stared carefully at Ethan's face like a puzzle piece suddenly clicking into place. Then recognition appeared. "Wait," Damian said slowly. "You are Ethan Cross." Nobody moved. Noah looked back and forth between them in shock. Walter sighed heavily like he knew this day would eventually happen. Damian laughed softly in disbelief. The Iron Phantom himself hiding inside a roadside garage. Ethan returned calmly to tightening bolts on the engine in front of him. "That name belongs to somebody else." Damian smiled wider. "No, that name still belongs to the man who crashed in Singapore and disappeared." Noah stared at Ethan speechless. Every teenager in the garage suddenly understood why Ethan moved differently around cars than ordinary mechanics. Why he spoke about racing like someone who had lived through every mistake personally. Damian folded his arms confidently. "You know, I used to watch your races as a kid. Back then I thought you were fearless." His voice lowered slightly. "Now I think you just ran away." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Frank stepped forward angrily, but Ethan quietly stopped him again. Damian continued. "I am building something bigger than this town has ever seen. A performance center, showrooms, sponsorship events, modern technology. People do not care about old legends anymore, Ethan. They care about the future." Ethan finally looked directly at him. Then build it somewhere else. Damien laughed. That is not how business works. He paused before glancing toward the teenagers gathered near the tool benches. Besides, teaching street racers inside a collapsing garage does not exactly sound like a future worth protecting. Noah clenched his fists immediately, but Ethan spoke before anyone else could react. You done talking? Damien studied Ethan carefully for a moment before smiling again. Actually, I have a better idea. He removed a pair of racing gloves from his coat pocket and tossed them onto the workbench beside Ethan. There is an amateur road race happening next month outside Albuquerque. Public event. Big audience. My company sponsors it every year. Walter narrowed his eyes immediately. Where are you going with this? Damien never looked away from Ethan. If Ethan cross races me and wins, I will sign over a permanent lease for this garage at $1 a year. The room froze completely. And if he loses, Damien continued calmly, you all leave when construction begins. Noah looked at Ethan in disbelief. Walter quietly whispered, do not do this. Ethan stared at the old racing gloves resting beside his hands while memories he had buried for 20 years slowly returned with painful clarity. Then Damien leaned closer and delivered the one sentence he knew would cut deepest. Unless the great Iron Phantom is too afraid to drive anymore. After Damien Wolf left the garage, nobody spoke for nearly a full minute. The sound of an old ceiling fan clicking overhead filled the silence while the racing gloves remained untouched on Ethan's workbench, like something dangerous nobody wanted to touch. Noah stared at Ethan with disbelief written across his face. Walter finally broke the silence first. You are not actually considering this. Ethan kept his eyes on the gloves. No, but the answer came too slowly. Frank Molina shook his head immediately. That kid does not want to race. He wants a spectacle. You beat him, he loses money and pride. You lose, he bulldozes this place and calls it progress. Curtis leaned against the tool cabinet with folded arms. And even if you somehow win, your leg will never survive something like that again. Ethan said nothing. That worried Walter more than any argument could have. The old mechanic walked toward the workbench and picked up the racing gloves carefully. You spent 20 years crawling out of that wreck mentally, Walter said quietly. Do not climb back into it because some rich fool insulted your ego. Ethan looked toward the garage entrance where Noah and the other boys stood listening silently. This place matters to them now. Walter sighed heavily. Then let me lose the garage. Buildings can be replaced. People cannot. Ethan limped slowly toward the office without another word. For the next 3 days, he avoided every conversation about the race completely. He focused on repairs, invoices, and customer cars while pretending Damien's challenge did not exist. But the garage felt different now. Tension hung in the air like an approaching storm. Noah noticed Ethan staying later every night after everyone else left. Sometimes the old mechanic would stand alone in the center of the garage staring at nothing for several minutes before shutting off the lights. One evening Noah returned after midnight because he forgot his jacket and noticed faint light glowing beneath a locked storage room near the back wall. Curious, he moved quietly toward the door and peered through a narrow crack between the frame. Inside the room sat a car hidden beneath a massive black cover coated in dust. Ethan stood beside it motionless with one hand resting against the fabric like someone visiting a grave. Noah stepped backward immediately before Ethan noticed him. The next morning, he told Walter what he saw. The old mechanic looked down into his coffee cup for several seconds before speaking quietly. That car has been sitting back there since the day Ethan rented this garage. What is it? Noah asked. Walter exhaled slowly. The last thing he ever drove before the crash. That night, after closing time, Ethan remained alone inside the garage listening to rain hit the roof while old rock music played softly through the radio. He opened the storage room door and stood staring at the covered car again. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled away the dust-covered fabric inch by inch. Beneath it sat a black Nissan GTR modified almost beyond recognition. The paint still carried faint scratches from another lifetime. Silver wolf emblems rested near the front fenders. Even standing still, the car looked dangerous. Ethan had not touched it in nearly 20 years. He lowered himself slowly into the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel with both hands. Memories returned instantly. Crowds screaming his name. Flashing cameras. Engines vibrating through his chest. Then came the crash again. The smoke. The spinning lights. The crushing silence afterward. Ethan closed his eyes tightly as his breathing became uneven. For several painful seconds, he nearly climbed back out. Then he heard movement behind him. Walter stood quietly in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You always looked more honest sitting behind a steering wheel," Walter said softly. Ethan stared forward through the windshield. "I almost died in this car." Walter nodded once. "Yeah, but you also lived in it." Ethan looked down at his damaged right leg. "Damien is younger, faster. His car is modern. I cannot beat him anymore." Walter walked closer and placed 1 coffee cup beside the dashboard. "Maybe this race stopped being about winning a long time ago." Ethan remained silent. A few minutes later, the garage door suddenly opened and Noah entered, followed by Frank, Curtis, and the other boys. They all froze the second they saw the black Nissan beneath the lights. Noah whispered the words before he could stop himself. "That is the Iron Phantom car." Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Ethan slowly inserted the key into the ignition for the first time in 2 decades. The engine hesitated briefly before roaring to life with a deep metallic growl that shook tools hanging across the garage walls. Every person inside the building stood completely still as the sound echoed through the night air. Noah felt chills run down his arms. Walter smiled quietly into his coffee, because in that moment, every person in the garage understood the same terrifying truth. Ethan Cross was not hiding from racing anymore. The morning of the race arrived beneath a pale desert sunrise that painted the mountains outside Albuquerque in shades of gold and red. Thousands of people crowded the roadside circuit hours before the event began. Vendors sold coffee and barbecue near the entrance gates, while modified sports cars lined the parking lots like a rolling car show. Most spectators came to watch Damien Wolf dominate another amateur exhibition race in one of his custom supercars. Few of them expected the old black Nissan GTR entering the paddock to become the center of attention. Conversations stopped the second Ethan Cross stepped out of the driver's seat. Some older fans recognized him immediately despite the gray hair and limp. Others pulled out phones in disbelief. By noon, social media exploded with photos and headlines asking the same question. Was the Iron Phantom really back? Ethan ignored all of it. He stood quietly beside the GTR while Noah and the boys checked tire pressure under Walter's supervision. Frank Molina argued loudly with Curtis Lane about suspension settings while pretending not to be nervous. The old mechanics had spent the last month rebuilding nearly every inch of the car by hand. They worked until sunrise most nights because none of them wanted Ethan carrying the weight alone. Damien arrived an hour later surrounded by cameras, sponsorship crews, and polished black trailers carrying his silver Wolf X9 supercar. The machine looked like something designed inside a military laboratory rather than a garage. Carbon fiber body panels reflected sunlight like metal blades while the engine produced a low mechanical growl powerful enough to vibrate through the concrete beneath it. Damien smiled confidently the moment he saw Ethan waiting beside the older Nissan. "You actually showed up," he said while removing his sunglasses. Ethan closed the driver's side door gently. "You talk too much." Noah nearly laughed out loud while Damien's expression hardened instantly. The race officials gathered both drivers for final instructions near the starting line as crowds packed the grandstands surrounding the circuit. The course itself stretched nearly 20 miles through desert highways and mountain roads filled with dangerous elevation changes and sharp corners. Long straightaways favored Damien's more powerful car heavily. The technical downhill sections favored experience. Ethan studied the road map silently, while memories he thought were buried forever drifted back into his mind. Claire Bennett appeared unexpectedly near the pit lane moments before the race began. Time had added silver strands to her hair, but Ethan recognized her immediately. "I figured if the world's most stubborn driver came back from the dead, I should probably see it myself," she said softly. Ethan looked genuinely surprised for the first time all morning. Claire glanced toward the Nissan before lowering her voice. "Do not race like you used to." Ethan stared at the mountains beyond the track barriers. "I do not even know who that man is anymore." Claire smiled sadly. "Good, because that man almost destroyed himself trying to become unforgettable." The starting engines drowned out the rest of the conversation. Drivers climbed into their vehicles, while spectators rose to their feet across the grandstands. Ethan settled slowly into the GTR cockpit and gripped the steering wheel tightly as old instincts rushed back through his body like electricity. His damaged leg ached immediately pressing against the pedals. Sweat gathered along his palms despite the cool morning air. For one terrifying second, he considered shutting the engine off and walking away forever. Then Noah appeared outside the driver's side window. "You already gave us something bigger than racing," the young man said quietly. "Just come back safe." Ethan looked at him silently before nodding once. The race began with a violent roar of engines exploding across the desert. Damien launched forward instantly, the Wolf X9 tearing down the opening straightaway with overwhelming acceleration. Ethan shifted smoothly through gears, but the GTR could not match the raw horsepower pulling away ahead of him. Within minutes, Damien built nearly a 6-second lead, while commentators excitedly declared modern engineering too powerful for nostalgia to overcome. But everything changed entering the mountain section. Ethan's expression hardened the moment the road narrowed into sharp technical corners. The old Nissan suddenly came alive beneath him like an extension of his own body. Every movement became precise. Every brake point arrived perfectly timed. The car drifted through corners with frightening smoothness, while spectators watched in disbelief as Ethan began erasing the gap little by little. Damien checked his mirrors entering Raven Pass and felt genuine panic for the first time all day. The black Nissan was there now, closer than it should have been possible. Ethan carved through each turn with terrifying calmness, while Damien fought desperately to maintain control at increasing speed. The crowd sensed it immediately. The old legend was hunting again. By the beginning of the final lap, the entire race had transformed into something nobody expected. The crowd no longer cared about Damien Wolf's expensive supercar or the sponsorship banners covering the track barriers. Every pair of eyes followed the black Nissan GTR moving through the mountain roads with impossible precision. Ethan Cross stayed directly behind Damien entering Raven Pass, while the roar of engines echoed across the desert cliffs like distant thunder. Inside the Wolf X9, Damien's confidence was collapsing fast. Sweat ran down his neck as he gripped the steering wheel tighter with every corner. He had spent years building his image as the future of performance driving. Young, fearless, untouchable. But now a 55-year-old mechanic with a damaged leg was hunting him down in a 20-year-old car. Worse than that, the crowd was beginning to love it. Damien glanced into his rearview mirror and saw Ethan's headlights growing larger again. The pressure twisted something ugly inside him. He accelerated harder entering the downhill straightaway, pushing the Wolf X9 beyond safe braking range as warning lights flashed briefly across the dashboard. Commentators shouted excitedly, while spectators rose to their feet, sensing the finish approaching. Noah stood near the pit barriers, barely breathing. Walter folded his arms tightly across his chest like he was afraid to blink. Claire Bennett watched silently from the media platform with one hand covering her mouth. She had seen this look in Ethan's eyes once before, 20 years earlier in Singapore. The same terrifying focus, the same cold calmness that appeared whenever he stopped caring about consequences. Damien attacked the next corner too aggressively, forcing the rear tires to slide slightly before recovering control. The crowd gasped loudly. Instead of calming down, Damien pushed even harder. The finish line was less than 2 miles away now. Ethan stayed close enough to overtake him at any moment. Then Raven Curve appeared ahead, the most dangerous turn on the entire course. Narrow, blind, unforgiving. Damien entered first at reckless speed, while Ethan followed only yards behind. For one brief second, Damien looked into the rearview mirror and saw the black Nissan positioned perfectly for a final pass. Panic exploded inside him completely. Desperate to block Ethan, Damien suddenly cut across the restricted inside lane, where warning markers clearly signaled unsafe road conditions. The move shocked everyone watching. Claire immediately stood up. Walter cursed under his breath. Noah felt his stomach drop instantly. Ethan saw everything unfold in front of him with horrifying clarity. The illegal line, the unstable rear suspension, the speed carrying both cars toward disaster if he committed fully to the overtake. And suddenly the past came crashing back into him all at once. Singapore beneath white rain-soaked lights. The spinning tires. The feeling of losing control while still refusing to lift his foot from the accelerator. For a fraction of a second, instinct screamed at Ethan to keep pushing. When the race Take the corner. Become the Iron Phantom one last time. His right foot pressed harder against the pedal automatically. The Nissan surged forward. Then Ethan heard Noah's voice inside his memory. You already gave us something bigger than racing. Everything inside him changed in that instant. Ethan finally understood what the garage had really become over the past year. It was never about engines. Never about old legends or proving himself again. It was about teaching broken people that destroying themselves was not the same thing as being strong. Ethan looked ahead one final time and made the choice nobody expected. Instead of attacking the inside lane, he turned the wheels smoothly toward the outer safety line and eased off the throttle completely. The black Nissan drifted away from danger while Damien blasted across the finish line alone beneath exploding cheers and flashing cameras. For several seconds, confusion swept through the entire crowd. Then the giant replay screen above the track showed exactly what happened. Damien crossing illegally. Ethan deliberately avoiding the collision. Silence spread across the grandstands like a wave. Damien climbed from his car expecting victory celebrations, but nobody was looking at him anymore. One person started clapping somewhere near the front rows. Then another, and another, until 70,000 people stood together applauding Ethan cross with a force that echoed through the mountains themselves. Noah sprinted toward the black Nissan with tears in his eyes while the other boys followed close behind. Ethan stepped slowly from the driver's seat, exhausted and trembling slightly from pain and adrenaline. Noah wrapped his arms around him without caring who was watching. This garage exists because you taught us something nobody else ever did, he said emotionally. Winning means nothing if you lose yourself getting there. Ethan looked across the track toward Damien standing alone beside the finish line. For the first time in 20 years, there was no anger inside him anymore. No hunger. No obsession. Only peace. The next morning, Damien arrived quietly at the garage carrying a folded contract beneath his arm. Without cameras or reporters nearby, he handed Ethan permanent ownership papers for the building and land. I thought speed was everything, Damien admitted quietly. Yesterday you proved I was wrong. Ethan signed nothing immediately. He simply looked around the garage while Noah and the boys worked beside the older mechanics laughing over some argument about engines. Sunlight poured through the open doors. Music played softly from the radio. The building no longer felt like a place where forgotten people came to hide from life. It had become a place where they learned how to start living again.